saying here, I thought the light went on without me. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Anyway. Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Here to do another video.
Oh, God.
Today we're gonna talk a little bit about the 62nd anniversary of JFK's assassination. On November the 22nd, 1963, the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. This event was monumental for the baby boomer generation, in the same way that 9/11 was for millennials, COVID was for Gen Z, and attack on Pearl Harbor was for the greatest generation and the silent generation. This event was the definitive event of that generation. Prior to that, things have been going pretty well. We're going to talk a little bit about President Kennedy and his background and what made him unique among presidents that preceded him. First of all was his age. He was at that time the youngest president ever elected. Secondly was his ethnicity and religion. He was the first Catholic elected to presidents of the United States in U.S. history. Prior to that, they'd all been Protestant, right? All 34 of them had been Protestant. And also, he was the first person of his generation, a baby boomer, he wasn't a baby boomer, but he was the first person of the silent generation to represent the baby boomers to be elected. The previous administration, Dwight D. Eisenhower's generation, they had epitomized the World War II generation. Eisenhower himself had been the chief general during World War II in the European theater. And he was a Republican, a moderate Republican, but he was a Republican. Kennedy was a Democrat. And another thing that made JFK's election in 1960 different than previous elections was the fact that this was the first time the debate between he and then Vice President Richard Milhouse Nixon was televised on TV. Before that, debates had not been televised on TV because TV was not as ubiquitous before this. And that's one of the things that won Kennedy the election decisively, because they took a poll among a number of Americans that said, who do you think won the debate, Richard Nixon or JFK? And people that watched it on TV thought that JFK won. People that listened to it on the radio thought that Richard Nixon won, because Nixon started sweating, and people were like, "Oh, that means that he was nervous and stuff, right?" So that helped JFK win. Immediately, in his inauguration speech that January, he said a famous quote that became the definitive quote of his presidency. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And the second part of that is where he beseeches the world, and he says, ask not what the United States can do for you, but what you can do for the United States. Basically, the same quote, but to the rest of the world, as opposed to just the citizens of the United States. What this meant, this imbued the younger generation with a lot of sense of purpose. And that's exactly what the baby boomer generation became, a generation with a sense of purpose. He would establish the Peace Corps. He would get the ball rolling for us to go to the moon. And he would be one of the chief warriors in the civil rights movement. during the debate, that was one of the topics. How the United States going to rectify this legacy of racism and discrimination? So for many minorities in the country, Mexican Americans, Black people, as well as like Puerto Ricans who didn't have the same rights, and especially in the South with African Americans, legal disabilities, Kennedy became their champion and the champion of the working class, which he had already started to be. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1947 and elected to the Senate in 1953. Obviously, coming from a political family, like I said, an Irish American family. Irish have had in this country a history of discrimination. When they first arrived here in the 1840s, as a result of the potato famine, because of their ethnicity as well as their religion, they were the first Catholics to come here to the United States. The United States was established as a Christian, Protestant Christian nation, and there was a lot of anti-Catholic laws. So when they first arrived here, there were signs on doors, no Irish need apply for certain jobs, right? And there were certain places where Irish Americans could not go to. The Martin Scorsese movie, Gangs of New York, really illustrates this. This dichotomy. So his father, his grandfather, and then his father, Joe Kennedy Sr., worked their way up in the local politics at first in the state of Massachusetts. Kennedy, Elisa, what's going on? Kennedy was born in Brookline, Massachusetts in 1917. He worked his way up the political machine, becoming the ambassador to England for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, the father. And he was priming the older son, Joe Kennedy Jr., to be the president of the United States. Like the father would drill it into their head, you're going to be the president, you're going to be the president. He was basically, picture Joe Jackson or Fritz von Erich. We talked about Joe Jackson and Fritz von Erich in music and wrestling, respectively. Well, Joe Kennedy Sr. was like this with politics. You're going to be the president. You're going to be in politics. You're going to be in. They didn't have an option. Other careers weren't an option for them. This is what they were going to do, and that's it. You know what I mean? But World War II happens while Kennedy is JFK, John F. Kennedy is in college, and he's in Harvard, and he writes a thesis on why England slept. In other words, we know that the background of World War II is that England and France, the Western nations, appeased Adolf Hitler. They didn't want to go to war again. They had gone to war during World War I, and they just didn't want to do it again. So they let Adolf Hitler get away with murder until 1939 when he invades Poland, and boom, it happens. This is called the appeasement during the prime ministership of Neville Chamberlain. So Kennedy writes about that, and World War II happens. And Kennedy and his brother, older brother that the father was priming to be the president, go to war. And Kennedy gets injured. The P-4-109, which was the plane he was flying, gets knocked down. He gets injured, but the brother passes away. So now he's the second oldest. So now it's up to him to take the mantle and become president, fulfilling his father's dream. So when he returns home, that's when he starts his political career. Again, like I said, 1947, running for the House of Representatives and then winning. And then in 1953, running for the Senate and winning. But finally, working his way up, and in 1960, becoming the president. So immediately he becomes the president, and he steps right into it. The Cold War. The Cold War has happened. The year prior to that, in 1959, in the small Caribbean island nation of Cuba, Fidel Castro comes to power. And Fidel Castro, at first, he had the sympathy of the United States because Batista, the guy he preceded, was a dictator. And Batista had the support of the United States, but he started to become too dictatorial, and the United States was like, no, we can't have that. So they initially supported Fidel Castro. But then they reneged their support when he reached out to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, the ideological enemy of the United States at that time, the Cold War was going on. So they're like, no, we withdraw our support. So immediately, Fidel Castro becomes an enemy. So one of the first things Kennedy does is he organizes the Bay of Pigs, a collection of ex-Cuban exiles from Miami, led by a gentleman by the name of Jose Miguel Battle, an ex-Cuban police officer, to invade Cuba and overthrow the Castro regime. It's a failure. So Castro gets even more upset. So he makes a deal with the Soviet Union to plant missiles in Havana, Cuba, aiming them at the United States. Now, keep in mind, the United States is Florida, which is an American state, obviously, is 90 miles away from Cuba. So if they have these missiles there, and they say they're nuclear missiles, they will aim at the United States, and they will destroy the United States, and this will begin World War III. So for a number of days, Kennedy has to decide, what does he do? Does he invade Cuba again with the United States Army? And he looks like a bully. Then he looks like another Hitler. The way that Hitler invaded Poland, a little ass country, and a big ass country like Germany invading a little ass country like Poland, Kennedy doesn't want to do that with Cuba. So he's very cautious. But at the same time, he cannot also allow Russia to have these missile bases on Cuba because, come on, if they were to aim it at the United States, then what? So it almost comes to a head, but thankfully the situation is resolved. America agrees to end, to disengage their missiles that they have planted in Turkey, which is a country right across from Russia in the Black Sea. And they'll take out those missiles, and the United States and Russia will take out the missiles that they have in Cuba. Now, so that's one of the tenuous things. But immediately then he becomes an enemy of the Castro regime, and there are several people in the United States that are socialist and communist, and they believe that Castro, what he did was right because what Castro did in Cuba was not all bad. Us in America, we tend to demonize him. And we look at him as this ultra bad guy. Remember when he died, he being Castro, pronouns, he being Castro, the American public, even the American public was polarized on him because although he did, restrict the rights of Cuba, Cubans, he also helped to even out the disparities in Cuba between the rich and the poor. For example, Cuba was at a very low literacy rate when he assumed power in '59, and they managed to raise their literacy rate up to 100. There was a lot of disparities in Cuba, racial disparities, where lighter-skinned Cubans were on the top of the socioeconomic ladder. They were richer, they were more prosperous, and darker-skinned Cubans, that are more of African descent, they were on the lower ebb of the economic stratum. So Castro helped to even that out. You know what I mean? So there were certain things that he did that were good. So there were certain people in the United States, even then in the 1960s, that supported him. And one of those individuals was Lee Harvey Oswald. And who is Lee Harvey Oswald? Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans, Massachusetts. In the 1910s, he actually was a cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. And he also had a lot of political connections. He goes into the Marines. But then in 1959, he denounces his American citizenship. And while he's in the Marines, he gets attracted to Marxism, he gets attracted to socialism, communism. So in 1959, he denounces his American citizenship and he moves to Russia, moves to the Soviet Union, where he marries his wife Marketa. But eventually becomes disillusioned with the Soviet Union. He writes in his letters, the money I'm making, I can't spend it anywhere. There's no nightclubs, there's no bowling alleys, there's no social events. Like there's nothing here in the Soviet Union, communist country. So he had these socialist ideals, but when they lived out, in lived experience, like people often say, communism sounds great on paper, everybody is equal, but in practice and reality, communism is a depressing situation to live in because you feel like you can never advance because everything is done for you. You feel like you can't achieve anything. So it's depressing. So he decides to leave the Soviet Union and return back to the United States, but he's still a socialist. So he becomes involved with a Cuban American advocacy group, pro-Castro group, right? And obviously they're upset at JFK because they feel like JFK is trying to undermine the Castro, the Castro regime. So comes to a head, 1963. Kennedy, it's almost going to be election season. This is, during elections, we start preparing the year before. The election year that year was 1964, but we start preparing before that. So Kennedy is visiting Dallas, Texas. And that's when, he's in the car and he gets shot in the head. And, his wife is right next to him, Jacqueline Bouvier, a.k.a. Jackie Kennedy. And he gets assassinated. And immediately there are rumors about who did it, because he had a lot of enemies. There were a lot of other people with motives that would want to assassinate JFK. One was the Klan, because like I said, he was an ardent champion of civil rights for Black people. And this is the South, Texas. Two was the mafia. His brother, the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, was going heavily after the mafia and after organized crime. And some would say, especially in the city of Chicago, where the mafia held sway, the Chicago political machine, Chicago had helped get President Kennedy elected. They had a lot of sway and in Massachusetts as well. Joe Kennedy was involved. He got his start in bootlegging. So the Irish mob, the Italian mob, the Cosa Nostra, they might have been heavily involved. They helped to organize working class Catholics, Italians and Irish, to vote for JFK and for him to beat Nixon, the hardcore Quaker Protestant, right? So, but now he's attacking them. Now his brother Bobby is attacking them. So they have a motivation. The anti-Castro people, of course, like the ones that Lee Harvey Oswald was working with. The pro-Castro people, because he failed to overthrow. The pro-Castro people that Lee Harvey Oswald is working with, the pro-Castro people and the anti-Castro people. Both sides have reasons to assassinate the president because he failed to overthrow Castro. He failed to. So the pro-Castro people want to overthrow him because he failed to do it, because he tried to do it, and the anti-Castro people want to overthrow him because assassinate him because he failed to do it. So he has a lot of enemies. Plus, Vietnam is in full swing at this point, but Kennedy feels like it's a local conflict, and the United States should not get involved. But at this time, the Democratic Party, which he's a part of, is split between two branches. The conservative wing of the Democratic Party, which is very pro-segregationist, as well as very pro-war, and hawkish on war when it comes to communist countries and communist movements, like the North Vietnamese. So they feel like the United States should get more involved with trying to overthrow the Ho Chi Minh and the South Vietnamese communists. So he has a lot of enemies. So immediately when it happens, nobody knows why. And there was a commission put out called the Warren Commission to investigate what happened. Some people say it was Johnson. Johnson was not getting along with the Kennedy brothers. They picked Lyndon Baines Johnson, a senator from Texas, in order to maintain the party unity. Kennedy was a liberal from Massachusetts. At this time, like I said, there were two wings to the Democratic Party. There were the Southern Democrats who had been with the Democratic Party since the Civil War, right? They weren't going to go to the Republican Party because the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. They didn't want to represent that, so they remained Democrats, even as the Democratic Party started to, under the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, move to the left. They wanted to remain Democrats, and they stayed remaining Democrats, but the Democrats kept getting more liberal and liberal, especially on civil rights. Started to advocate more for black rights and things of that nature. But at this time they still wanted to keep the Southern Democrats, so they're like, oh, okay, we'll make a compromise. We'll have a Northern liberal Democrat in JFK and a Southern conservative Democrat in Lyndon Johnson on the ticket, and that'll fill out the ticket. But they didn't really respect Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General under under his brother's administration, they didn't get along at all. So Johnson had reason to do it, and I've recently found out that the Israelis might have had reasons to do it as well, because Kennedy wasn't like some of the other presidents subsequently and previously who bend the knee to Israel. He didn't do the whole going to the Wailing Wall ritual and putting the yarmulke on his head and praying at the Wailing Wall. So they might have had reasons. But as far as Lee Harvey Oswald, Kennedy wasn't the first political figure that he tried to assassinate. He also tried to assassinate the Senator George Wilkins, because Wilkins was an ardent conservative, anti-communist, as well as a member of the John Birch Society, which was an extremist anti-communist organization in this country. So, and it was determined by the Warren Commission that Lee Harvey Oswald did murder the president, but and that he was a lone gunman. But there have still been, theories out there as to what happened. This was unprecedented because, we've only had a few political assassinations in this country. Obviously, Abraham Lincoln was the first one. Then you had James Garfield. And then you had William McKinley, and then you had JFK, and JFK was the youngest. And the optimism of his inauguration speech was no more. That was the end of Camelot, basically comparing it to the King Arthur myth. Camelot, before King Arthur died, was a perfect place. After King Arthur died, it was all out war and chaos in mythological Middle Ages, England of the Middle Ages. Well, that was like here. Minutes later, Lyndon Johnson is sworn in, and Lyndon Johnson, who was the then vice president, who was the unlikable vice president, becomes the vice president. There's a famous photo of it. And immediately he escalates in Vietnam. There is an incident the year after, They're called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which it is believed that one of the United States' ships is attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin in the South Pacific, and that becomes the pretext for the United States to become directly involved in the conflict in Vietnam, which will shape the 1960s. But as for Lee Harvey Oswald, 2 days later, he is assassinated himself by a man named Jack Ruby. Now, Jack Ruby is believed to have ties to the mafia as well. Jack Ruby's reason for assassinating Lee Harvey Oswald was he didn't want uh, Jackie Kennedy to be distressed. He felt like Jackie Kennedy was being distressed, so he took it upon himself to murder Kennedy's assassin. And as far as civil rights, Lyndon Johnson, the following year in 1964, passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with the cachet of the sympathy that people had for the Kennedy assassination. He feels like he has the American people's sympathy, so he goes ahead and does it. And the following year, in 1965, he also um, enacts the Voting Rights Act, effectively putting an end to Jim Crow segregation that had existed in this country since the 1890s with the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. So Kennedy's assassination, he basically finished up Kennedy's work. But Lyndon Johnson, because of the Vietnam conflict, remained really unpopular. And we talked about it before in 1968, where he refuses to run for president of the United States for his party's nomination. And JFK's brother, former Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, then runs for president and also gets assassinated in 1968. There are four major assassinations in the 1960s, five really. Medgar Evers was first, JFK, Malcolm X in 65, and Martin Luther King in 68. Four major assassinations in the 1960s that really shaped the consciousness of the 60s. But and the Kennedy family has experienced a lot of tragedy after this. Ted Kennedy tries to run again against Jimmy Carter. He primaries Jimmy Carter in the 1970s. He is unsuccessful due to his drinking problem. He gets into some issues. JFK's son also passes away in 1997, JFK Jr. Excuse me, 1999. 1999, JFK Jr. passes away. Many people were priming him to be the next successor. Recently, JFK's nephew ran for president in 2024 under the Democratic ticket, was unsuccessful, losing to Kamala Harris, and then switched parties and joined the Trump administration as the health advisor. In the Trump administration, we know about Bobby Jr. and some of the crazy stuff that he said. But JFK's daughter, the senator Caroline Kennedy, has a son, uh, Jack Schlossberger, that many people are saying that will maybe run for president and will be up age for it. by 2028. He's already 30. I mean, he's 32. So it's a possibility. So the Kennedy name continues in politics, particularly Democratic politics, but even Republican politics now in the Trump administration. So, I mean, that's the story. Like I said, there are major events in American history that define American history: the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. Probably for that generation, the Revolutionary generation. Then you get the Civil War generation. You have Bleeding Kansas, and then you have the attack on Fort Sumter, which begins the Civil War. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, for that Civil War generation. But in modern times, of course, I'll say from the 20th century onward, you have a couple of them. One is Pearl Harbor. One is Kennedy's assassination. Maybe the Titanic. You would include that as well. But Pearl Harbor, definitely. The Kennedy assassination, definitely. Um, the attacks on September the 11th, 2001, COVID in 2020, and probably the assassination of this year of Charlie Kirk are some of the bigger ones that define American history. But this definitely was a trajectory change because most people had not experienced the assassination. The people that were alive then did not experience the assassination of William McKinley, or the assassination of Abraham Lincoln or James Garfield. They only experienced this political assassination, and there would be more yet to come in this very divisive decade. And this event kind of kicked off the divisiveness of this decade. But what I find unique, is that Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't just any random dude. Like I said, he was a cousin to Theodore Roosevelt. He was also a descendant of Robert E. Lee. Ironic, because Robert E. Lee is somebody that is linked, kind of tacitly at least, to the assassination, another assassination that took place in 1863 of Abraham Lincoln. Robert E. Lee was the Confederate general, the lead Confederate general, and Abraham Lincoln, of course, was the president of the Union Army. Like, there are so many similarities between Lincoln and Kennedy, both at their respective times advocates for the Black community, but both kind of dragged their feet when it came to their advocacy for the Black community because they were moderates. Both Lincoln and Kennedy, although on the left side of the political aisle, Lincoln a Republican, Kennedy a Democrat, but again, times were different. They kind of dragged their feet. There were other people in the party that were much more liberal than they wanted them to go ahead and just, in Lincoln's case, abolish slavery. In Kennedy's case, grant civil rights. And they weren't willing to do it for obvious reasons, but they made that move. They made that jump, and it kind of cost them their lives. So it's weird how Lee Harvey Oswald is not just some random guy. Like, I thought he was just some random guy, just like John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Lincoln. But they aren't. They were unique. They had ties, and they had these strong political beliefs that motivated them to carry out these political assassinations. It wasn't like Reagan's assassination attempt in 1981 was a little bit different because it wasn't like John Hinckley Jr. had any, in my opinion, any strong political convictions. And likewise, with Thomas Matthew Crooks and his assassination attempt on President Donald Trump in 2024, it wasn't like he had any strong political convictions. With Charlie Kirk's assassin, though, Tyler Robinson, or alleged assassin, again, alleged, because all these guys have, conspiracies attached to them. He did have strong political leanings. Usually the guy or the person does have strong political leanings. Usually they're not just doing it out of nowhere. Like Gandhi's assassin, Natram Godse, was a Hindutva advocate, and he didn't believe in the partition of India, which Gandhi was advocating. Or, for example, uh, Yigal Amir, the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. He didn't like the fact that Rabin had signed the Oslo Accords and he was being accommodating to the PLO. Or Anwar Sadat's assassin, right? He didn't like that Anwar Sadat was capitulating to the Israelis in the historic Camp David Accords in the 70s. So usually a guy has strong political leanings, but also they'll pinpoint if it's some kind of conspiracy, they'll pinpoint it on somebody with these strong political leanings so that it makes sense. Again, we go back to Martin Luther King's assassin, and Martin Luther King's assassin was a segregationist, right? James Earl Ray. He was a segregationist. He was a racist. So then they'll pinpoint on him, even if it had nothing to do with him. They'll pinpoint it on him as well. You know what I mean? As part of a conspiracy. So there's still this conspiracy out there with regards to JFK, but I don't know what to believe. I just know that it was an event that in the early 1990s, Oliver Stone put out a movie, and it resulted in the signing of the JFK Act in 1992, which prohibited federal authorities to go into the files of JFK. Kevin Costner stars in it. It's right now. It's free on YouTube because this is coming up on the event. So, peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, Lisa, for joining the chat and contributing. Love you guys. Peace.